Thank you for joining us today. I pray that our time together will help you experience Jesus and to share his grace. This week we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 18. We are continuing our Elijah sermon series, and we want to rise up as the people of God to be men and women who share love and light into this dark and crazy world. Just like the prophet Elijah, who was surrounded by so many bad things in his life, yet he followed God obediently and was willing to be an example for us to learn from and to follow even today. So let's look at 1 Kings chapter 18. Let's do a little reading, and then we'll unpack this passage together and see how it applies to being sons and daughters of God, living as light in this world. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 18 together. We're going to be starting in verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year of the drought, saying, "Go, present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the earth." So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Now Obadiah revered the Lord greatly, and Jezebel was killing off the prophets of the Lord. Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid 50 to a cave, and then provided them with bread and water. And then Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and all of the wadis. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals." So they divided in the land between them to pass through. And Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in another direction by himself. Let's stop right there, the word of the Lord. So what we see here is Elijah is now, the time has come for him to go back to Ahab. Remember, this all started with a confrontation with Ahab, the evil king, and Elijah said, "As sure as the Lord lives, that there will be no rain or dew in the land until the beckoning of my word from the Lord." And so it's been about 3 years, no rain, no dew, and this famine has just taken its toll. If you remember how God provided for Elijah by the streams of water, and then he also sent him to Zarephath, and God was willing to help him there, and the famine and things were so bad, even in the farther away kingdom of Sidon and Zarephath, that even Samaria, which was the locus of control for the famine, was devastating to the people there. And so we see this just horrible image of there's famine in the land, there's the drought, and things are starting to come out at the seams. But now the word of the Lord has come to Elijah and says, "Elijah, the time has come, so go and see Ahab and present yourself to Ahab." And so Elijah starts his journey, right? He just doesn't hop in an Uber. He has to go from Zarephath to Samaria. And it's along this journey that these events unfold. And this is the preparation for the fulfillment of God's return to blessing back on the land, despite the unrepentance of evil King Ahab. And I want us to notice 3 things today. 3 things from the life of Elijah and the characters in this story. And the first thing that I want us to notice throughout this entire story is consistency. Okay? Throughout this 3 years, Elijah has been consistent in relying on the Lord. He has looked up to God, and God has showed him the way. And Elijah's been obedient to wherever God said to go, he would do it. And God has always shown up being consistent. Now, but as Elijah represents consistency and dependence on God, and we see that God's consistently meeting the needs of his people. We see that for 3 years, Ahab has been stirring up trouble, has been causing lots of ridicule. He's turning his back on God. He is doing everything he can to ignore the fact that if he were to repent and that the nation would cling to God instead of these false idols, that things could change. But for 3 years, Ahab has consistently rejected the word of the Lord. Just as faithful as Elijah is consistently following God and obeying the word of the Lord, and just as God is consistently meeting the needs of those who depend on him, Ahab is the exact opposite. And so as we look for lessons among this story, just even the first couple of verses, that Elijah is consistently showing up when God calls. Elijah says, I will follow. And Ahab is consistently ignoring the call of God in his life. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes too am inconsistent about maybe when I obey God. Or maybe there have been times in my life where it's like, God, I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to be faithful. I want to just be rebellious. And I'm sure all of us have been in those situations. And I know there's some people that are watching this today that are so consistent in following God. It's their heart's desire when they wake up. And sometimes those people feel like they're not doing enough good things, that they're not doing enough big things. And what we see here in the life of Elijah is just every day being consistent and depending on the Lord. I think of the story of Daniel, how he prayed and he was consistent in his prayer despite the rule of the king to say you can't pray. Daniel, even in the face of adversity, was consistent. Even in the face of avarice or in the face of boredom, he still was consistent to follow the Lord. And this is such a lesson for us today, is because God is this faith with God, this journey with God is a marathon. It's not just this short sprint. Okay, I do this one thing and I'm good for good. That faith in Jesus and walking as a disciple with Jesus requires everyday consistency. Not perfection, but consistency. Just sometimes showing up is half the battle. I was thinking about elementary school and all the things that I accomplished during that time and junior high and high school. I get these little spelling bee awards and they get grades and all these different things, but at the end of the day, that didn't matter. It was just being able to show up every day, to participate every day, to put your best foot forward every day and keep trying and trying and trying. It's like learning a bike. You just don't get on a bike and just drive immediately. You have to learn and you take baby steps. And I just remember as Emmaus was learning to walk, he just took these baby steps and he didn't do it all in one day, but he was consistently practicing and getting better. And now that kid can run circles around me because he was consistent in his development. What about you and your walk of faith and your spiritual development? Are you consistently taking the time to be with God, to spend time with God, to learn about God, to be with God's people? Not because that you just have to do this check mark list, but it's this situation of you love God so much that you just want to be with Him. I am not a perfect spouse, but my wife can tell you that I'm pretty consistent, that she knows a lot about me because I'm there. I show up. I'm in the present. She knows what kind of candy I like. She knows what kind of food I like. She knows what kind of movies and music I like, because we show up for each other in this relationship. God is wanting you to show up in your relationship with Him. Yes, it's important to show up at church. It's important to show up in Bible study. But more importantly is that everyday journey that you show up and you're willing to hear God and to obey God when push comes to shove. Because if you don't get the practice beforehand of showing up for God, you're going to miss it when the big things in life come and He asks you to do something. You're not going to be prepared because you've not done the training. Elijah has been in training for the last 3 years of dependence and relying on God. What about you? Are you needing to learn some new skills about how to be consistent in your faith walk with God? Because sometimes we have seasons in our lives where we ignore God. We're more like Ahab. We're more focused on what we can do for ourselves as opposed to what God wants us to do for Him. So let's go ahead and see what else we see in this story of 1 Kings chapter 18. We see that God has called Elijah to go to speak to Ahab. And so he is so consistent that he's like, yes, Lord, I'm willing to go. Even though it may cost me my life, I'm willing to go. So what happens? He went to present himself. And notice that the writer of the text says that the famine was severe in Samaria. If it was so bad in Zarephath where people were preparing to die because they didn't have food, can you imagine how bad it must be in Samaria itself? Because the drought was so bad in Samaria, can you imagine the suffering, the loss of life that the people have gone through? And yet, does it seem to have affected Ahab at all? Let's look here. The famine was severe in Samaria. Verse 3, Ahab summoned Obadiah. Now, Obadiah is the servant of Ahab. He kind of is like his, kind of rules the house, kind of his right-hand man. And there's a lot of confusion as to, well, how is it that Obadiah is faithful to God and yet lives in the house of Ahab? We don't really know a lot about that, but we know that he was a man of faith because Scripture says that he was he revered God, he followed God. And he was so much of a follower of God that when Jezebel started to kill the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah, whose name means servant of the Lord, as this servant of the Lord saw the persecution that was going on around him, that he hid 100 prophets of the Lord in 2 different caves, and he fed them and gave them drink. And that had to be done consistently. There's that word consistently again. And so what we see immediately is we see compassion in the life of Obadiah. He is trying to live his life in a way that makes a difference for God. And he is compassionate. He is taking on this great task of hiding these prophets and feeding these prophets and giving them drink. It's his life is on the line because he sees the value of these people, these prophets, these followers of God. He knows it's his duty to help take care of them. Isn't that an amazing image of what it is to be compassionate as a follower of God? You know, I'm sure you know there's certain people who just have great gifts of compassion. They look at people and they love on them and they take care of them. You know, some people are like me. I struggle in the compassion department. I really wrestle with serving somebody else instead of maybe getting what I want, right? So Obadiah is this great image of what it is to be compassionate. And you take Obadiah and then you compare him to what's going on in King Ahab's life right now. I don't think when you mention the word Obadiah, when you mention the word Ahab, that you think of compassion. Let's look at the text here. This is verse 5, after it tells what Obadiah has done. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land into all the springs of water and all of the wadis," that's another seasonal river, "and go to all these places, and perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals." Now, while Obadiah is caring and concerned and compassionate for the people of God, here you have Ahab concerned about the livestock. Now, don't misunderstand me. It is very important to take care of animals. Even Proverbs tells us that a righteous man will care for his animals. And that God has created animals and taken care of them. It talks about the cattle on 1,000 hills, and there's not a sparrow that falls that God doesn't know about, and how that he takes care of them. But here we see this king who his head is messed up. And where he should be caring about the people of Israel, he's more worried about his horses and his cattle. Now, I don't even think that he's compassionate about the animals. I don't even think that Ahab is actually compassionate towards the animals. I honestly think that they just represent another way that he would be inconvenienced if they die. So if his horses die, it would be inconvenient to him because he'd have to walk everywhere. He couldn't travel. It would be inconvenient because his status symbols have been erased. I think it'd be inconvenient to him to be like, well, this died, so I'm not going to be able to eat as well now because the steak is all gone. I truly believe that he's not even compassionate towards the animals, that he is just looking at how this would affect him. And so it's so important to the king that the king is not sending other people out, that the king himself and his right-hand man are traversing the land to find places to feed his horse while his people die of starvation. We can't have his horse to die because he would have to walk everywhere. Now that would not be a good thing. But Obadiah, the example of compassion, taking the risk of hiding these prophets to meet their needs consistently. Wow, what a man of faith. Putting his life on the line, that he is definitely demonstrating our third thing that we can look at today, and that is courage. God calls us to be consistent. God calls us to have compassion, and God calls us to have courage. Be strong in courage. So as Obadiah is traversing the land looking for water to feed the cattle and the horses, that he runs across, divinely ordained by God, he runs across the road where Elijah is coming back into the country. And so Obadiah is so excited to see Elijah. He bows down and says, "Oh, you're here." And Elijah, and I can tell in his kind of gruff voice, I just hear him in my head saying, "Go and tell Ahab that I'm coming." And with that, Obadiah is a little surprised. He's a little taken off guard. Says, "Well, if I go and tell the king that you're here, the Spirit of the Lord may lift you away because you've been gone for 3 years, and if that were the case, the king will kill me because I made him believe that you were there, but he's not. That you're not. And if I die, then the 100 prophets die, all because you decide to show up today." And so Obadiah presents his case to Elijah. Says, "I can't just go making quick announcements. I have people's lives that hang in the balance, so I have to make sure that you're going to be there, that you're going to be consistent." Because in the eyes of Obadiah, Elijah has not been around. He's not been consistent. Obadiah has been consistent in feeding these prophets, but he doesn't know if the Spirit of the Lord is going to take Elijah away. And so Obadiah asks for a guarantee of consistency and say, are you going to show up? And Elijah, with an oath, takes an oath and says, "I will visit Ahab today." And so what we see in this conversation is the great courage that Elijah says, I'm going to meet Ahab. I have determined I'm not going to hide. The Lord has called me. We've been waiting for this time, and I assure you we're going to go and we're going to be courageous and we're going to face the king. And at that demonstration of courage on the behalf of Elijah, Obadiah says, "I too can have courage. I too will go and tell King Ahab, I believe that the Lord is moving in this place." And so he trusts in Elijah. He trusts in the Lord. And Obadiah is willing to die, if need be. And so he goes and he tells King Ahab that Elijah is there. And so Elijah and Ahab come together for a meeting. And we're going to stop right there when it comes to our Bible story, because we're going to talk about that meeting and the after effect next week. But as we look at this simple story of two prophets, that you have Obadiah, this preserver of prophets, and you have Elijah, the prophet on the run, Samaria's most wanted person, that we see such similarities in their stories and how they contrast to the king Ahab, his story. You see how consistent Elijah is depending on God and how consistent that Obadiah is taking care of those prophets. We see the compassion of Obadiah taking care of those prophets and meeting their needs consistently. And we see how that the king is not compassionate. The king is more concerned about his car, well, we'll say horse, but his prestige, his status symbols, than he is his own people. And we see how God is compassionately taking care of his prophets through people like Obadiah and taking care of the widow of Zarephath. That God is compassionately continuing, even in the midst of the rebellion of Israel, God is showing his consistent compassion upon these people. And finally, we see that Elijah is boldly going to confront King Ahab, and that Obadiah is boldly going to confront King Ahab too, and that they are willing to be courageous. They're willing to face death in order to be obedient to God. I think there's something that needs to be said about obedience here at the end of this lesson. You see, obedience is an interesting concept. You see how that Elijah was obedient to God in all things. If God said it, he was willing to do it. And it's one thing to be obedient to God and to be willing to serve in obedience. And then you have this contrast. You have Ahab. He was not willing to serve in obedience. He expected to be served by obedience. He was going around, demanding kings swear an oath that if they were to see Elijah, that they would bring him in or they would die. He was expecting Elijah to be obedient and no longer follow the ways of Yahweh. You see, Ahab was expecting to be obeyed, but not willing to obey God. You see, that's something we need to be thinking about as well, because a lot of times we expect other people to obey us. As a parent, I expect my children to obey us, but am I willing to be obedient to God as a good parent so that I can get obedience from my children? Do I look at God as a parent that I can be obedient to? Or am I too busy demanding God to serve me? Am I too busy demanding my church to serve me that I'm missing out on the opportunity to serve those in my church or in the community? So what Elijah 18 tells us a lot about obedience is we are to obey God instead of having it our way. Do things God's way. It's not necessarily about doing it my way. We see that Elijah was consistently faithful. Obadiah was consistently faithful. And Ahab was consistently unfaithful. We see that Obadiah was compassionate and that God was compassionate. Yet Ahab was not compassionate. Finally, we see that Elijah and Obadiah lived courageous lives. They were being strong in the Lord, willing to face death and an unhappy king just to serve God. Now, what about you? What about your life? Are you consistently showing up for God? Because he's consistently showing up for you. Are you willing to have compassion on other people, to love God and to love others? Because God is consistently compassionate for you. Finally, are you courageously living, being willing to be uncomfortable, to put it all on the line to follow God? Because God was willing to put it all on the line and live courageously to face death on the cruel cross just to be with you. Jesus demonstrated love in action, courage, through his sacrifice on the cross, just to be with you. If we want to be people of God, to rise up and to be a good example, we need to be consistent in following God. We need to be compassionately following God, and we need to be courageously following God. I hope that our time together has helped you to see from the life of Elijah lessons that we can learn to be obedient to God, where God has planted us right here, right now. I want to thank you for joining us. Be blessed.